Hello, everybody. Welcome to FAA Part 107 Essentials, your beginner pilot guide to flying drones responsibly, legally, and professionally. Over the next few minutes, we're going to walk through the core rules that show up most often on the Part 107 exam. This includes visual line of sight, altitude, and speed limits, careless or reckless operation, pre-flight responsibility, and pilot accountability. Whether you never touch a controller or you're just brushing up for the test, these are rules that every beginner needs to know. Let's get started. So what is Part 107 really? It's the FAA's regulatory framework for small unmanned aircrafts. This includes drones that are flown for commercial or professional purposes. But here's the mindset shift I want you to make right now. This isn't just a test of whether you can fly a drone. It's a test of whether you understand how to operate one safely and lawfully inside the national airspace system. Drones share the sky with manned aircrafts, they operate near people and property, and when flown carelessly, they can cause real harm. That is why these rules exist. And here's the study tip. Once you understand the why behind a rule, it stops being a random fact to memorize and starts being a logical answer to a real safety question. That's the lens we'll use for everything in this guide. Let's get into rule number 1, and arguably the most misunderstood rule for beginners. You must keep your drone within visual line of sight at all times. This means you or a visual observer helping you need to actually see the aircraft well enough to track its position, its orientation, and its flight path in real time. Here's a trap a lot of new pilots fall into. They assume a clear camera feed or a strong video link counts as maintaining awareness. It doesn't. The FAA is talking about unaided human vision, your own eyes, not your tablet screen. If the drone drifts behind a building, into a cloud, or just gets too far away from you to track it with your eyes, you violate visual line of sight. No matter how good that FPV footage looks, and remember, even with the visual observer helping out, the remote pilot in command is still the one accountable for the safety of the whole operation. Let's break visual line of sight into 4 practical pieces. First, direct visual contact. You need to see the drone with your own eyes, not through binoculars or through a camera feed. Unaided vision is the standard. Second, real-time awareness. You have to be able to continuously judge the drone's position, altitude, attitude, and direction of flight. Even a brief lapse creates a problem. Third, the visual observer option. A visual observer can be stationed elsewhere to help maintain that visual contact, but they need to be in direct communication with you, the remote pilot, at all times. And fourth, watch out for the common violations. Flying behind your unaided visual range, flying behind buildings or terrain, flying at night without proper lighting, or leaning on FPV alone. These are the mistakes that trip up beginners again and again. Rule number 2, maximum altitude. This is one of the most heavily tested numbers on the entire exam. You cannot exceed 400 feet above ground level. Under standard part 107 operations, that is your ceiling. Why 400 feet? Because it creates a buffer between drones and manned aircrafts. Most general aviation traffic operates above that threshold, so staying under it reduces the risk of mid-air conflict in controlled airspace. And pay close attention to that phrase, above ground level. That measurement is taken from the surface right beneath your drone, not sea level, not some fixed benchmark. There is an exception you'll learn later involving structures where you're allowed to fly higher than 400 feet near a building, but for now, lock in the core number, 400 feet above ground level. If an exam question describes a standard outdoor flight with no structure mentioned, that's your answer. Rule number 3, maximum ground speed. Here's a rule beginners love to forget. Everybody remembers the altitude limit, but the ground speed limit doesn't get nearly the same attention. And that's exactly why the exam likes to test it often paired with the altitude question in the same scenario. Under Part 107, your maximum allowed ground speed is 100 miles per hour, which is roughly 87 knots. Notice that is your ground speed. your speed relative to the ground, not airspeed relative to surrounding the air. This distinction matters in windy conditions, but for the exam, just remember the number 100 miles per hour. My advice, don't study these two limits separately. Pair them in your memory. 400 feet, 100 miles per hour. Altitude and speed together every time you do your review. Let's pause for a second and connect these last two rules. Altitude and ground speed are really two sides of the same coin. They're the operational limits that keep drones manageable, predictable, and safe inside the National Airspace System. The FAA didn't pick these numbers arbitrarily. They work together to keep low altitude airspace orderly. So, as you study, don't think of the altitude rule and the speed rule as two separate flashcards. Think of them as one safe boundary with two dimensions and memorize them as a pair. That single shift in how you study will make exam questions that combine both limits much easier to answer. Rule number 4, no careless or reckless operations. Rule number 4 sounds simple on the surface, but it carries a lot of weight. You may not operate your drone in a careless or reckless manner that endangers the life or property of another. Unlike altitude or speed, there's no number attached to this one, and that's intentional. The FAA's question is always, would a reasonable, responsible remote pilot make this same decision in this same situation? Flying over a crowd, operating near an active emergency scene, flying distracted, or ignoring an obvious hazard. All of these could fall under careless or reckless, even if no other specific rule is technically broken. Think of this rule as the FAA's catch-all. They can't write a regulation for every possible bad decision, so this standard exists to cover the judgment calls. On the exam, that means even a scenario that doesn't obviously break a specific rule might still be a violation under this broader standard. Always ask yourself, would a responsible, informed pilot make this call? Since this rule is principle-based rather than a hard number, it helps to see it in action. 4 examples to keep in mind. Flying over crowds. Putting your drone directly above uninvolved people create unnecessary injury risks if something goes wrong. Flying while distracted. Splitting your attention between the controller and, say, a phone call cuts down your ability to react to hazard in real time. Flying in emergencies. Operating close to an active fire, police, or rescue scene can interfere with manned aircraft and first responders, and that's a serious public safety issue. Lastly, ignoring weather hazards. Launching into high winds, poor visibility, or an approaching storm when the risk is obvious is a failure of pilot judgment, plain and simple. None of these trip a specific numerical rule, but all of them can land you in violation of the careless or reckless standard. Rule number 5, pre-flight responsibility. Before every single flight, the remote piloting command, the RPIC, is responsible for confirming the drone is in safe condition to fly. This is not a box checking formality, it is a legal responsibility, and skipping it has real consequences. A proper pre-flight covers the physical condition of the aircraft, airframe motors, propellers, battery charge levels, the controller and communication link, GPS signal quality, and a review of the flight area for hazards. It also means checking NOTAMS, notices to air admissions, and any temporary flight restrictions that might affect your airspace that day. Here's the key idea. Conditions change. A drone that was fine yesterday might have a cracked propeller today. Airspace that was clear this morning might have a TFR by the afternoon. The RPIC has to verify current conditions before every flight, not just once back when they got certified. Let's frame pre-flight as a 4-step mental loop. Inspect the aircraft, assess the airspace, evaluate the environment, then confirm and launch. This isn't a box to tick off and forget, it's a professional habit. Pilots who build a consistent, thorough pre-flight routine are far less likely to run into in-flight emergencies that trace back to something preventable. And on the exam, when you see a pre-flight question, the FAA is really testing one core idea. The RPIC carries ultimate accountability for the condition of the aircraft. Before every single flight, no exceptions. Rule number 6, registration and accountability. If your drone weighs more than 0.55 pounds, That's 250 grams. It has to be registered with the FAA before you fly outdoors, whether you're flying commercially under Part 107 or recreationally. The registration has to be renewed every 3 years, and this isn't just paperwork. It creates a chain of accountability. If a drone is involved in an incident, investigators can trace it straight back to its registered owner. The registration number itself has to be displayed somewhere on the drone that's accessible without tools, so it can be checked in the field without anyone disassembling the aircraft. And here's a point that trips people up. Accountability doesn't stop at registration. Even if someone is physically flying the drone, a student, an employee, a visual observer, the remote pilot in command is still legally responsible for the whole operation. You cannot hand off RPIC responsibility to someone who doesn't hold a valid Part 107 certificate. A question beginners get tangled up on. When multiple people are involved in a flight, who's actually responsible? Part 107 is clear. There is only one remote pilot in command at any given time, and that person holds full legal responsibility. Let's walk through the roles. The remote pilot in command must hold a valid Part 107 certificate, has final authority on every decision during the operation, and is legally responsible for safety from pre-flight all the way through landing. The visual observer helps the RPIC maintain visual contact with the drone. They don't need a certificate themselves, but they must stay in direct communication with the RPIC the entire time. The person manipulating the controls can operate the drone under the RPIC's direct supervision without being certified, but the RPIC has to be present and ready to step in at any moment. And the owner or employer may handle registration and equipment responsibilities, but the on-site remote pilot in command is still the one holding safety and regulatory accountability during the actual flight. So, why do these rules matter? These 6 rules aren't arbitrary bureaucratic hurdles. They're the FAA's attempt to fold drone operations safely into the national airspace system, a shared environment used every single day by commercial airlines, general aviation, military aircraft, and emergency responders. Each rule addresses a real category of risk. Once you see that, your relationship to the material changes. Instead of memorizing isolated facts, you start to see a coherent philosophy. Keep the drone visible, keep it low, keep it slow, operate responsibly, prepare thoroughly, and own your role as pilot in command. That philosophy doesn't just help you pass the exam, it shapes how you'll actually fly. And one more thing worth remembering. The drone industry is growing fast. Real estate, infrastructure inspection, agriculture, emergency response, filmmaking, educating, and so much more. Every professional pilot is, in a sense, an ambassador for that industry. How you fly and how seriously you take these regulations sends a signal about whether the drone community deserves more access and fewer restrictions down the road. Let's look at where this knowledge actually gets put to work. In real estate, aerial photo and video gives buyers and agents a perspective on properties and neighborhoods that you simply can't get from the ground. In inspection work, drones cut the cost and risk of checking towers, bridges, rooftops, power lines, and pipelines. No more sending a human climber into a dangerous spot. In agriculture, precision drone imagery helps monitor crop health, catch irrigation problems, and optimize treatment across large farming operations. And in media and film, drone footage has completely changed commercial video production. Sweeping aerial shots that used to require a helicopter or a crane are now possible with a fraction of the cost and risk. Before we move into practice questions, let's run through all 6 rules one more time as a quick reference recap. 1. Visual line of sight. Keep the drone within unaided visual range at all times. Camera feeds do not count, but a visual observer in communication with the remote pilot in command can help. 2. Maximum altitude. 400 feet above ground level for standard operations, with exceptions near structures. 3. Maximum ground speed. 100 miles per hour, about 87 knots. Commonly tested alongside the altitude limit. 4. No careless or reckless operation. You can't fly in a way that creates unnecessary risk to people, property, or other aircrafts, even when no numerical rule is broken. 5. Pre-flight responsibility. The remote pilot in command must verify the aircraft and the operating environment are safe before every flight, covering the aircraft, batteries, airspace, and weather. And 6. Registration and accountability. Drones over 0.55 pounds must be registered with the FAA. The registration number must be visibly displayed, and the remote pilot in command is legally responsible regardless of who else is involved. Keep this slide bookmarked. It's your cheat sheet going into the quiz. Time for our first practice question. Under standard Part 107 operations, what is the maximum altitude a small UAS may fly? A. 400 feet above mean sea level. B. 400 feet above ground level. C. 500 feet above ground level. D. 400 feet above the highest nearby obstacle. Let's take a second to think about it. The correct answer is B. 400 feet above ground level. The key phrase is above ground level, not mean sea level and not measured from a nearby obstacle. That measurement is taken from the surface directly beneath the drone, and it's the standard ceiling for most Part 107 flights. Option A is a classic trap. Sea level is a reference used for instrument flight, not for drone altitude limits. The lesson here, when you see an altitude question, read closely for above ground level versus mean sea level. They're different reference points, and the FAA loves to test whether you can tell them apart. Question 2. A remote pilot is flying a drone at a location where they lose sight of the aircraft behind a tree line. The pilot's camera feed is still working perfectly. Is the pilot in compliance with Part 107? A. Yes, because the camera feed maintains awareness of the drone's position. B. Yes, as long as the flight is under 400 feet above ground level. C. No, because visual line of sight requires direct human visual contact. And D. No, but only if the pilot doesn't have a visual observer. Correct answer, C. No, because visual line of sight requires direct human visual contact. The FAA's visual line of sight requirement is based on unaided human vision, not on what appears to be on a camera or monitor. The moment the drone disappears behind the tree line, the pilot has lost visual line of sight. Question 3. A remote pilot in command launches a drone without performing a pre-flight inspection. During the flight, a damaged propeller causes the drone to lose control and strike a bystander. Who bears legal responsibility for this incident under Part 107? A. The drone manufacturer, because the propeller failed. B. The visual observer, who should have noticed the damage. C. The remote pilot in command, who failed to perform a required pre-flight inspection. And D. No one, because accidents are unforeseeable. The correct answer is C. The remote pilot in command under Part 107. The remote pilot in command bears ultimate responsibility for the condition of the aircraft before flight. A proper pre-flight inspection would have identified the damaged propeller. Failing to conduct that inspection is a direct regulatory and safety failure. The FAA does not accept "I didn't know" as a defense when the pilot had both the duty and the opportunity to check. Let's bring it all together. Visual line of sight, maximum altitude, maximum ground speed, no careless or reckless operations, pre-flight responsibility, and registration and accountability. These 6 rules are the essential core of what the FAA expects every Part 107 pilot to know before flying professionally. They're not the only rules in Part 107, but they're the ones that show up most consistently on the exam and matter most in the field. Master these and you got a solid foundation for the far more advanced topics ahead, which includes airspace classifications, weather minimums, waiver procedures, and night operations. 3 habits to take with you. Review the 6 rules regularly until they're automatic. Practice applying them to realistic scenarios instead of just reciting definitions. And always ask yourself, what would a responsible, informed remote pilot do here? Next up, we'll dive into airspace classifications, Class G.